Hey guys, it's Brian with Retired at 40, and I'm really excited today. We have a couple new things that we've never done before on the channel. We're going to try a new way of cooking today, and I'm also going to show you a new way of rehydrating, as well as sharing my grandmother's noodle recipe, because we're going to do wild turkey and noodles. So we have this delicious looking wild turkey today. And one of the advantages of our move to Iowa was I have relatives that hunt and just give us venison and wild turkey and other things. So thanks, Brent, if you're watching. And wild turkey has a pretty distinct look to it. It almost looks more like pork than the turkey you're used to. And it's also very low fat, which means if you don't cook it right, it can become extremely tough very quickly and almost to the point where you don't want to eat it. That's where our friend, the Sous Vide, is going to come in. So Sous Vide is more of a type of cooking. The company that makes this one is called Anova, and they're pretty much the most well-known company that makes them. And what Sous Vide does is it's just a warm water bath, and the meat or whatever you're cooking sous vide, it actually goes inside of another bag and it cooks inside of its own juices, and it keeps everything extremely tender, but it also happens to be a good way to rehydrate things. It just attaches to the side of a pot. The model that I have is actually Bluetooth enabled, or you can do it manually. The nice thing about the Bluetooth model is there's tons of recipes that are already preset in the app. This recipe actually calls for 140 degrees, so I'm going to take it down to 140. I'm going to hit start. And then you can see this is going to start circulating the water and warming it at the same time, and our temperature is already going up. So while we're waiting for that to heat up, I'm going to put together the most important part, I think, for the turkey, and that is what you're going to add the flavor with. And if you can use fresh herbs, those are the best. I don't have any fresh rosemary, but I'm going to do 1 tablespoon of rosemary. I'm going to do a few sprigs of thyme, and then I'm going to do 5 to 6 fresh sage leaves. And if you do have fresh rosemary, 2 or 3 sprigs is fine. And then the last thing I'm going to add to this is 2 teaspoons of dried garlic, and we just happen to have freeze-dried garlic, which is really strong, so I'm going to cut that down to just over a teaspoon. So that's our big time shot of flavor right there. So our Anova is ready. We're going to take these spices and we're just going to drizzle these and kind of make a rub on this turkey. We're going to really try and cover it as well as we can and work it into the outside of the meat. Then we're going to take this turkey, we're going to drop it into a Ziploc bag. We're going to try and remove all of the air out of it, seal it up, and then we're going to give it a bath. So you want this completely submerged, and then we take a clip and just clip it to the side so it's not floating around. And then we're going to set our time for 8 hours. You heard me right, 8 hours. And unlike other ways of cooking wild turkey like this, the longer this stays in here, the more tender it will get. So if you want it even more tender, you can leave it in for 12 hours if you want to. Okay, so our 8 hours is up now. I'm going to take this out of the water and let it rest for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to work on our noodles. We're going to start with 3 eggs. And this recipe is kind of loosely based on a recipe. So we're going to just do a little trial and error today. We're going to start with 3 eggs though. And then to those 3 eggs, we're going to add just a pinch of baking soda. And then for the flour, I'm going to start off with half a cup of flour. So really what we're trying to get is a dough that's a little bit softer than a bread dough would be. We also just need just a little splash of milk, maybe about a tablespoon. I'm going to go ahead and add another 1/4 cup of flour, and we're just going to slowly add flour in until we reach that right texture. All right, we're going to do 1 more 1/4. That puts us up to 1 cup of flour. So I'm just going to do 1/8 this time. We're up to 1 1/8 cups now. I'm going to do 1 more 1/8 of a cup, and that'll put us up to 1 1/4 cups. So I think what you're going for is probably somewhere in between 1 1/4 cups and 1.5 cups of flour. So I'm just going to go ahead and take some flour, lay it out on the counter, and you want your consistency of this dough. You don't want it super sticky, but you also don't want it to be like bread dough or something. You want to be able to roll this out. You want it to be a little softer than bread dough, so maybe closer to like a pie crust or something like that. Once this is the correct texture, and a lot of this also is your personal preference, we're going to roll it out about the size of a pizza is what you should go for, and then you can take a pizza pizza cutter, or you can use a pasta cutter or a knife, and we're just going to cut these into strips. And again, this is total preference, whether you want your noodles to be wider or thinner, close to like a fettuccine noodle. Another thing to consider is that these are actually going to almost double in size. Once you get them in broth, they will puff up quite a bit. So in order to fill up 4 trays in the freeze dryer, I think we're going to have to double the noodle recipe because we have about 3 to 3.5 pounds of turkey. So I'm actually going to do another batch, which is just fine because we're actually going to want to let these dry out a little bit before we throw them in some broth. While we're waiting for those noodles to dry, I've got 8 cups of stock or broth going on the stove. That's what's going to inject all of that flavor into the noodles. These noodles have been sitting out for about half an hour, and you kind of just want just a little bit of a crust on them. That's kind of what you're going for. Once our 8 cups of broth is all boiling, just turn your heat down. We're going to add our noodles. All right, that is some comfort food right there. So there's all our noodles. We're well on our way to some home cooking here. This is only half of the noodles, so I still have my other half sitting over here. I'm just gonna do half at a time and see where that 8 cups of broth is gonna get us, because we haven't added in our turkey yet. We're gonna hold off on that. This is gonna simmer for about 20 minutes. This has been on for about 15 minutes now, and this is gonna be where you kind of want to decide which way you want this to turn out. So this can actually be more like a soup, or it can be more like a stew where it's a little thicker, or you can change the amount of meat that goes into it if you want it more meaty, or if you want more noodles. So here's what ours looks like. This is the way I really like it. I like it a little bit soupier, and then when you add in that meat, it's gonna thicken up quite a bit, and that meat is gonna take on some of that broth flavor too. So it's about time to add in our meat. So I'm gonna divide this in half. This was about 3.5 pounds, so I'm gonna do a little over 1.5 pounds of meat in each section because we are doubling this recipe. I wanna make sure that there's enough to fill all of the trays. So I'm gonna add in our wild turkey. We're gonna let that sit for about another 5 minutes. You don't wanna leave it in too long because the turkey will start to dry out a little bit. But that right there is what you call Midwest comfort food. So my first batch is ready, and it looks like, just on first glance, I think that this is probably gonna do about 2 trays. It makes a pretty big portion. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this first batch on these 2 trays and then get working on my second batch. So we are all done, and I'm gonna change something from last video. I'm actually gonna weigh everything in grams. So I have 1177 grams on this first tray, 1150 on the second tray, 1104 on the third tray, and then 1115 on that last tray. That last tip came from a viewer, and they recommended doing grams instead of pounds and ounces because it's a lot easier as opposed to trying to divide using pounds and ounces. So we've got one last thing before we're ready for the freezer, and that's to use our tray stackers. These are available in our store. It makes them real easy to do the pre-freeze because you can stack these up on top of each other. And that's that. I'll put a link in the description for our store where you can purchase these. These are ready to go, and I'm actually gonna do a full cycle on these, so I'm just gonna carry these right down to the freeze dryer. All right, I'm really excited to see how this turns out. Like I said, this was my grandma's recipe, and she's no longer with us, so this is the closest I can come to remembering her, is using her recipe. And it's just a good recipe. We're padded up, sealed up, doors closed. We'll see you in a bit. And we are done in 27 hours and 7 minutes. This new software just never ceases to amaze me. It's so much faster than the old one. So I'm really liking how these turned out, and I've been doing this long enough that I can pretty much tell whether this is gonna work well or not, and I can really tell that these are gonna do awesome. So let's go ahead and get a weight on these, and then we'll take them upstairs and we'll get them rehydrated. So I really like that this all stayed in one piece, and you can see how much that it actually shrunk in the tray, quite a bit. Our first tray, 263 grams. Second tray, 229 grams. Third tray, 225 grams. And then our final tray, 255 grams. All right, so let's do a little quick math. We've got our sample size here. And our sample is 71 grams. So before we freeze dried, we had 4,546 grams of material. And after we freeze dried, we had 972 grams of material. We took 3,574 grams of water out of our turkey and noodles. So if you put this into grams, it makes this a whole lot easier.
You can take your before weight minus your after weight. That'll give you the amount of water that was removed. Take the amount of water that was removed and divide that by the before weight. That'll give you 79%. You can then take that 79% and multiply it times any sample size that you have, and that will give you the amount of water you need to rehydrate.
The other thing I like about the metric system when we're rehydrating is that you can use milliliters instead. It's just a lot easier to work with than doing fractions. So if I did my math right, I can add this to a Ziploc along with this, throw it back in the sous vide, and with any luck, in about a half an hour, we'll have some turkey and noodles that are exactly like they were before we freeze dried them. So for the best rehydration practice, I would suggest that you weigh each amount of food that you're getting ready to put in Mylar or into food storage before it goes into the bag or ball jar or whatever you're doing. And you can figure out how much water needs to be added to each bag to completely rehydrate each bag. Only because there's so many variables when it comes to recipes and things like that that they can change a lot from one cycle to another. Now let's check on our turkey. Let's try it out, see what it tastes like. Perfect meal for a cold, crummy day like it is here. Here goes nothing. The noodles do really well. The turkey rehydrates really well. That's a winner. This is a little bit watered down, and this is more like a chicken noodle soup right now just because of the watered down. Lots of flavor. Wild turkey and noodles is a winner. In the meantime, this is Retired at 40. We'll catch you next week. Miss you, Grandma.